Uh, okay. Um, Happy to be part of this conference. And unfortunately, I will not have any case studies that I would present in my talk. I will only look into more of a perspective of analysis of concepts and how they relate between several accounts in posthumanist philosophy. So I would like to open my talk by referring to the first part of the title of the talk, Challenges to the Art and Aesthetics Relation. And what do we mean by art and aesthetics relation, and what kind of challenge does it face? In this talk, we focus on two implications of what I call challenge. So on the one hand, there's a historical philosophical reading of how a challenge was posed to the relation or correlation of art and aesthetics by the 20th century artistic movements such as Dadaism and conceptual art, and respectively how that was philosophized by the thinkers from the 20th century. And on the other hand, by challenge I mean the 21st century challenges to the 20th century challenges to the relation of art and aesthetics, and maybe more specifically the ways in which posthumanist thinking attempts to redefine art and aesthetics without assuming the centrality of the human subject. That is to say that in this talk I would like to engage with a translation of the discourse on post-aesthetics in the 20th century theories of art into the 21st century terrain of posthumanist philosophy. The discourse on post-aesthetics, if we can call it that way, in the 20th century has been canonically significant because it attempted to philosophically characterize the shift from medium-specific art to conceptual art, or we could say from aesthetics to post-aesthetics, if that is not too grand to claim. So the first section of the talk inquires into the attempts to redefine art beyond sensorial experience proposed by such thinkers as Arthur Danto and Theodor Adorno. And then in the remaining part of the talk, we will look into the posthumanist philosophizing of art and aesthetics found in the works of Carey Wolfe and Alexandra Wilson. So what do we mean by the art-aesthetics relation, and for what kind of reasons have the 20th century artistic practices and theoretical standpoints posed challenges to the relation of art with aesthetics? If we recall Kant's critique of power of judgment, the judgment of artwork is constructed precisely through aesthetic experience as a reflective judgment that arises from the free play of imagination and understanding. That is, from judgment that does not subsume objects under the universally valid concepts, but instead searches for a rule in relation to the particularity of the aesthetic appearance. Therefore, because Kant considers beauty not as an objectively determined law of nature, but as a feeling that is intersubjectively shared among a culture of rational human subjects, the reflective judgment assumes its characteristic as purposiveness without purpose, as disinterested pleasure, a dynamic interplay of subject and object as it is specified, or at least underline at least one of the implications in the first citation. And following Kant to the 20th century, modernist theories such as Clement Greenberg elaborate the relationship of art and aesthetics by defining the artwork through its medium specificity, which is to say the condition of an artwork as the exploration and purification of the features unique to its artistic medium. And again, like with Kant, Greenberg sustains the coupling of art and aesthetics because art is defined through its formal aesthetic conditions. But what matters for our focus is how the coupling of art and aesthetics is put into question. The historical avant-gardes of the early 20th century, such as Dadaism or later conceptual art or performance art in the 60s, put the appeal to aesthetic specificity of the artwork into question. Duchamp's infamous work, The Fountain, I'm sorry, I don't have the picture to show it, but I'm sure all of us have seen it more than once. And so the fountain, an industrially manufactured porcelain urinal, has no aesthetic properties in the Kantian or Greenbergian sense. If we are to consider a urinal as a Duchampian fountain, then we must first and foremost assume not its medium specificity, but the artistic and institutional framing of context and intention, its conceptual, not aesthetic dimension. And perhaps this is not the best quote from Danto. I maybe should have quoted Danto's piece on the art world, because Danto, as he says, an artwork is premised precisely not on the aesthetic properties of the physical object, but rather an object embedded within and mediated by a set of institutions and symbolic practices, which is, for short, the art world. For Danto, the art world is both sociological and philosophical in the sense that it indicates sociologically the artwork's constitutive relation with a set of historically specific institutions and practices, and philosophically it indicates the priority of conceptual framework and the interpretation of concepts, intentions over aesthetic properties. So when we interpret an artwork, we situate the artwork's concept within a narrative of history, its cultural significance, and so the artworks are always already theory-laden. Artworks do not pre-exist the institutional context. The institutional context enables the interpretation of artwork. So Danto's theory of art concerns not providing an account of aesthetics, but rather an ontology of the artwork that is tied to its potential to be interpreted and articulated in institutional discourse. And then Adorno likewise poses a challenge to the classical relationship, to the classical formalist relationship of art and aesthetics, insofar as he proposes the term truth content. I'm not sure if it is included in this citation, but the artwork is not grounded in its semantic meaning, representational content, or its capacity to arouse aesthetic pleasure, but instead it is the capacity to give determinate, explicit form to the social contradictoriness of the very artwork. The object's non-identical identity of itself as artwork, as itself as a fetishized commodity. For Adorno, thus, an artwork is a locus that crystallizes social contradictions found in, for example, Schoenberg's atonal compositions or Beckett's theatrical minimalism, and so on. So the truth content of the artwork is not in its capacity to represent social contradiction, but rather inasmuch as artwork enables the space of contradiction to be perpetuated as such, the simultaneous dependence and independence of aesthetics from its social conditions. So the constitution of the artwork enables both illustrating social life while at the same time being separate from it. So in this sense, Adorno goes beyond Danto, as he both decouples and at the same time recouples the art, the notion of art with aesthetics, insofar as aesthetics enables the experience of dissonance rather than harmony. But when we consider the rethinking of the human and decentering the human in posthumanist thinking, we can observe in general, and as it has been mentioned throughout the previous talks today, that there is a shared commitment to question human exceptionalism and its anthropocentric chain of being, while humanism champions the sovereign, rational, autonomous human subject. The target of posthumanism in the likes of, for example, Catherine Hales, Haraway, Braidotti, and so on, is the dissolution of humanism as an intellectual project. The collapse in the boundaries of human, non-human, organism, machine, organic, inorganic. So such anthropocentric dichotomies have been declared not as rigid, but rather as historically constructed, technologically and ecologically permeable and entangled. But what I would like to focus more on in this talk is, do such frameworks have a specific, explicit account on the relationship of art and aesthetics, or at least an account on art or an account on aesthetics? And if there are not such explicit formulations, we could even question, does posthumanism presuppose, and is it even capable of offering an account of art and aesthetics in the first place? Of course, because we are in this conference, our answer is yes. So art and aesthetics, despite being, we could say, perhaps on the fringe of scholarship as a sort of explicit object of study, of course it is a legitimate question for posthumanism, and we have seen numerous applications of posthumanist methodologies and concepts in artistic practices. If we look at the previously mentioned accounts proposed by Kant, Greenberg, Danton, Adorno, of course they are not exempt from the accusations of anthropocentrism in their thinking, because they assume the human capacities such as language, linguistic, the ability to think linguistically, or to evaluate cultural moral values, to have individualized creative agency, to express its authorship, and so on. So that could certainly be aligned with a certain kind of implicit or explicit anthropocentrism. But what we are concerned with here is not only the decentering gesture that we can find in various posthumanist, prominent posthumanist accounts, but what are the posthumanist accounts that explicitly base themselves or explicitly express a certain kind of theory of art or theory of aesthetics as a kind of posthumanist art, posthumanist aesthetics? So, as already mentioned before, Kerry Wolfe and Alexander Wilson are such examples, or at least in my opinion, and I think they fall into an interesting even relationship between each other, because as we will see, Wolfe on the one hand focuses much more on the element of art, while Wilson focuses much more on the element of aesthetics. So to go first of all to Kerry Wolfe, in general, for posthumanities, the starting point for considering a theory of art is first and foremost achieved through the shifting from treating art as a distinctively human activity towards treating art where humanity is decentered. The point where one posthumanist theory becomes distinct over another is, I would claim, when we look into the strategic specificities of how we would need to decenter humanity in our theory of art. So for Kerry Wolfe, the strategy of decentering the human in a theory of art is proposed through the conceptual tools available in systems theory. Generally speaking, systems theory is an anti-humanist, or perhaps in Kerry Wolfe's case, posthumanist theoretical framework, precisely because it displaces the centrality of individual human subjects' intentions, experiences, or meanings, and instead the epistemological primacy is given to the system. It is first the system that generates its own distinctions and produces its own reality, rather than the individual intentions, experiences, or meanings. We should emphasize that in as much as the explanations in systems theory depend on cybernetic thinking, the very character of the system should not be regarded as merely deterministic. Rather, systems operate on recursive feedback loops, and they are self-referential. In systems theory, such as that of sociologist Niklas Luhmann, an author highly influential to Kerry Wolfe, the concepts of operational closure and structural coupling indicate a two-level dynamic of how social, psychic, or biological systems maintain autonomy while at the same time remaining related to their environments. Hence, operational closure conditions a system to independently reproduce itself exclusively through its own operations. But this does not imply ontological isolation of one system from another. Structural coupling means that a relation between a system and its environment is a selective internal response to the environmental complexity. Systems irritate and condition one another without collapsing into a single system. Luhmann's famous example is the relation between consciousness and communication. Consciousness cannot communicate and communication cannot think, yet each depends on the other as a condition of mutual reproduction. So moving on to art, art is also a system, and for both Luhmann and for Wolfe, and it applies the concept of autopoiesis, self-production, self-organization. It has been mentioned in the talk before me. So applied autopoiesis to art system. Art system is, therefore, if we follow Luhmann, a kind of social system, perhaps a post-human social system, constituted through aesthetic communication. So like other systems, an art system self-referentially communicates with itself. Yet as Wolfe observes, the point is not merely in the critique of representation exemplified by art systems' self-referentiality, but rather in its specific character of interaction with its environment, consisting of other non-artistic systems. As the artwork does not represent an external reality, but rather constructs its internal environment through formal distinction and selection, each system it follows assumes its own quote-unquote blind spot. What links a system to the world is also what conceals the world from the system. For Wolfe, therefore, art systems assume a specific mode of observation. Because art is concerned with its form rather than mere contents of communication, be it medium specificity, as in Greenberg, its conceptuality, as in Danto, its truth contents, as in Adorno. Art systems aim to reflect on their own outside, or in other words, to observe the unobservable. So while every social system, as Wolfe follows Luhmann, is self-referential, the specificity of art system lies in its second-order reflectivity. The quote-unquote blindness of a second-order observation is formally the same as the blindness of a first-order observation, yet it is contingently not the same. Second-order observation as the observation of observation is directed at the very capacity of how a system constructs reality by its distinctions and exclusions. Therefore, the second-order observation characteristic of art systems is capable of exposing and destabilizing the distinctions and concepts that ordinarily remain invisible. That is to say, as the distinctions that remain invisible in first-order social systems, the second-orderliness of an art system renders the very blindness of a system, that is, the contingency of first-order distinctions. And this is why such an assumption is so important for Wolfe, because he considers art systems as post-human artistic practices. The second-order observation of first-order distinctions, such as human-non-human, organism-machine, organic and organic, expose their own contingency and therefore challenge the ontological exceptionalism of the anthropos. The anthropos follows a contingent functional distinction indicating an accidental configuration of a system and its environment. As Wolfe paradoxically concludes his concept of artwork, it is a form without formalism. He has a separate paper with such a title. It is a form of drawing distinctions, not sensorial properties. So concerning distinctions, an artwork transcodes the environmental contingency of ontological dichotomies, and such an exposure of contingency is internalized as an artwork's non-contingent formal decision as such. That is, contingency is the very condition of possibility of post-human art. An interesting counterpart to Wolfe's attempt to go beyond anthropocentric relation of art and aesthetics is Alexander Wilson's account of posthumanist aesthetics. Here, different from Wolfe's conceptual priority of posthuman art over the issues of aesthetics, Wilson considers the possibility of non-human aesthetic experience. Aesthesis, as Wilson explains, indicates not a perceptual capacity exclusive to rational human subjects, but it instead marks the evolutionary biological dynamism between organism and its environment. Aesthesis as a sensory and perceptual responsiveness immanent to living systems, both human and non-human. So, by examining aesthesis as sensory and perceptual responsiveness immanent to living systems, Wilson employs a different strategic framework to that of Wolfe. A theory of posthuman aesthesis does not aim to challenge human exceptionalism by destabilizing the very ontological category of anthropos. Rather, human aesthesis extends the field of individuals capable of aesthetic experience from the domain of humanity to more than humanity, incorporating the individuals constituted by evolutionary biological complexity. But here we face the question, how does one prevent such an ontological reconstruction of aesthetic subjects from turning it into a merely anthropomorphized aesthetic experience? One of the ways we could answer is by situating aesthetics within the capacity of biological self-organization, rather than within the rational faculties of understanding and imagination, or linguistically mediated subjectivity. This kind of situatedness of aesthetics within biological self-organization, rather than rational cognition or linguistic mediation, on the one hand, as already mentioned in Vaiva's talk this morning, marks the commitment to navigate beyond both contemporary vitalism and eliminativism. The conceptual placement of aesthetic experience in biological self-organization does not presuppose neither the ontological proliferation of consciousness-bearing subjects, nor does it presuppose the ontological reduction of sensibility to purely computational neurophysiological functions. Instead, what Wilson is proposing is that a kind of biological materialist theory of aesthetics directed at envisaging a form of evolutionary artificiality, whereas aesthetic experience is defined through the reception of the instability and distribution of sensory among more than human assemblages. That is to say that multiple conditional fields constitute aesthetic experience: environmental adaptation, neurophysiology, as well as technical and economic affordances, and so on. Consequently, the multiple conditioning of posthuman aesthetic experience, its distribution among multiple more than human assemblages, entails the characteristics of both underdetermination and overdetermination. Posthuman aesthesis is underdetermined insofar as it is irreducible to a single linear causal chain of interpretative framework, because it always remains open-ended and contingent. Simultaneously, aesthetic experience is overdetermined because every sensory event is shaped by multiple layers of mediation: environmental adaptation, neurophysiology, technical and economic affordances, and so on. So, on top of that, Wilson wedges their theory of posthuman aesthetics between both an evolutionary adaptationalist theory of aesthetics and a theory of aesthetic autonomy. Aesthetic experience, understood as an evolutionary biological process, is not caused merely by evolutionary selective pressures, as it is in the case of adaptationalism, nor is aesthetic experience removed from causal relationships of evolutionary selective pressures, as it would be in the case of aesthetic autonomy. Following the dual characteristic of underdetermination and overdetermination, Wilson expresses support to the premise that aesthetic experience is driven by sexual selection. Yet, sexual selection is not manifest merely as a surplus of survival adaptations, where survivalist adaptations are prior to sexual selection. Rather, survival adaptation and sexual selection are mutually co-evolutionary. By arguing so, Wilson suggests to consider aesthetic experience not merely as a product of selections as such, but rather as the very process leading to cognitive distinctions. Aesthesis not as an adaptation, but as the evolutionary biological process of how living systems deal with novelty. In short, as aesthesis indicates the nonlinear movement of cognition from imperceptibility and free-floating differences to recognizable and fixed differences, Wilson's account of posthumanism frames aesthetics not as the outcome resulting from biological evolutionary factors, but rather as the very evolutionary biological process that leads to the possibilities of novel trajectories, rather than homeostatic adaptation or predetermined adaptation to environmental pressures. And unfortunately, I know there's not enough time to give a proper conclusion. I would maybe like to just give 2 points on the comparison between Wolfe and Wilson. So, on the one hand, their shared posthumanist response to the 20th century discourse on relationship of art and aesthetics attempts to not only de-anthropomorphize the definitions of art and aesthetics, but it also, a shared concern is how to deal with spontaneity in relation to experience without assuming the ontological centrality of the human. And of course, a difference between Wolfe and Wilson is so that Wolfe, we could say, inherits a certain kind of discursive bias from the 20th century, because he prioritizes art over aesthetics as as Danteau and to a certain extent Adorno would do. Meanwhile, Wilson seems to rehabilitate the very idea of aesthetics in the context of posthumanist thinking, and perhaps he's more radical in a sense by suggesting that we should be thinking not about art but aesthetics. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rokas, for such a theoretically dense presentation.
I'm sorry.
Now we have got time for questions. Okay, I have got a question regarding Kerry Wolfe and this definition of artwork, which you said, it is form without formalism. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, what about process? And because this form without formalism, it's just like it seems that it's very does not going on anything. And what about process, technology and information? I would like to bring this concept of information, which in my opinion could bring some processuality, and I wonder if Wolfe does something like this.
Of course, Wolfe assumes a kind of informational framework because he considers systems as a kind of informational structure. So a system means that it is both receiving information from its surrounding environment, but it is also communicating with itself. And concerning the processual side, but what is exactly achieved when we talk about the process? Process in relation to form, or?
No, rather I think about process in relation to artwork. Mm-hmm. Like this processuality of I don't know, already Heidegger talk about this, that artwork is something that is going on, what there is always process rather than something fixed and immobilized. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if Wolfe, because I was surprised by this definition, form without formalism. I wonder if he includes some processuality in it.
I may not have a very elaborate and informative answer to this, but obviously when he talks about form without formalism, he suggests us to look at artworks not as a certain kind of objects, and even more so, these objects are not somehow possessing aesthetic properties. So in this sense, he is suggesting that systems are not identical or even how to say epistemologically compatible with objects. Like system and object, they are not on the same epistemological category, because an object is still based on certain kind of aesthetic definition, while a system is much more based on a kind of form of observation, and then in a kind of form of communication. And I think that's all I could respond for now.
More questions? Okay, if nobody has got, also I have got one small question about Wilson.
Yes.
Because I wonder, like if you talk, Wilson, he explains aesthetics as like this relation between cognition and perception, yes. And I wonder, don't you think that this post-human art, if we can use this category, also like includes these both relation to reality, like without separating them. I mean, like in the same way like Wilson does.
Without
separating cognition and perception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, I mean, he has the term epistemesthetics, and in his book...
I'm talking rather about this post-human art.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, perhaps we can say that this contemporary art, like which involves this different perspectives and different walls, like these projects, we are doing something like Alexander Wilson suggests, like mainly not separating cognition from perception, but including, like, and that differs a lot from 20th century art, which, as you noticed, also was more conceptual.
Mm-hmm. I think it coincides with probably more than one development in aesthetics in the 21st century, both in how, I guess, technology, digital technology is incorporated, and how the specific non-human technological perception is tried to be considered as an element of curation and art exhibition, but at the same time we have the ecological context and how it is to be considered as a kind of aesthetic notion, perhaps, or as a kind of aesthetic, or the possibility to engage with it through aesthetic experience. And I suppose alongside that, posthumanism gives a kind of I suppose we could say it kind of covers all of these sort of shifts in aesthetics. I'm actually not sure if I'm answering it in the direction that you are asking, but I don't know. Perhaps you have any answer.
Okay, perhaps maybe perhaps we will talk later, I think. But we have got just, if not too long.
I'll really try to be quick. So regarding the systems theory, and of course one of the aspects of operational closure, it always seems to be carrying inherent dualisms of sorts, especially regarding arts and aesthetics. So circling back to some naive notion of aesthetics as a first philosophy, in regard to the topicality that you spoke today, do you see any bounds for the post-system theory to come to existence? Thank you.
Well, I could maybe give a little glance over the development of systems theory as a kind of intellectual tradition, if we could say it that way. So systems theory defined through Luhmann is only one of the episodes in the kind of history or development of systems thinking as such, because Luhmann is responding to, I guess, a thinker that is considered as a founder of systems theory is Ludwig von Bertalanffy, and he would look at systems as necessarily biological, and in the sense that only biological systems are capable of self-organization. But then Luhmann is suggesting that no, actually, that is not able to account for how social conflicts occur in society. So there has to be a certain kind of social systems theory. But then there are people that go beyond this kind of systems thinking as Luhmann has described, and there's obviously thinking applied more to history, for example, or thinking applied more on a kind of global scale. So, for example, Emanuel Wallerstein is a proponent of world systems, which again builds up on the foundation of systems thinking, but he elaborates it as a kind of historical system, and then forming a kind of global world scale system. And then we have I mean, we're talking more, I guess, about 80s and 90s, and then obviously we have Earth systems, and we have the proponents of the Gaia theory. And then Latour, in a sense, could be seen as a critic of systems thinking, because he's criticizing Gaia, the Gaia hypothesis. So he is, in a sense, by proposing actor network theory, he's criticizing systems thinking, because system assumes a certain kind of closure, even though it is not obviously like fully complete, but still it is a certain kind of a system. It is not merely a network. Thank you.
Thank you a lot.